All right, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for From Diversity to Intersectionality and Making Change from Within. I'm pleased and honored to introduce Dr. Gina Messina, who will lead today's session. Gina has been a facilitator with the Institute for Women, Wellness, and Work for quite some time now. And if you've attended any of our previous sessions, you've heard her talk about emotional intelligence and leadership. This is a deeper dive into that with a big focus on diversity and intersectionality and how that impacts your leadership style as well as the leadership of the organization that you're working for. And with that, I'll turn this over to Gina.
Hi, everyone. Again, apologies for the little bit of glitches that we had, but really delighted to have all of you here today. And this, I think, is such a critical topic when we're thinking about leadership and, of course, our emotional intelligence, but just really our abilities to engage with others and to appreciate one another and to recognize the ways that we often really limit ourselves and interrupt the diversity process, I guess, might be the way to say it, because we're not approaching it the ways that we should. So I'm going to start off our presentation with a poll. I know it's everybody's favorite. It's mine. I'm just kidding. But I have to tell you, if you're like me, I have attended more diversity trainings than I can count. And I would like to ask, have you found the diversity trainings that you've attended to be beneficial? Have they really helped your organization and you to engage in diversity efforts? Go ahead and you can send in your vote, yes or no, or not sure if you're not sure. And we will go from there. We'll give it about another 30 seconds. Okay, so interestingly, I say interestingly, 67% said yes, and 33% said no. So that to me is interesting for a number of reasons, because I generally think that our diversity efforts lack consistency and a way to really weave the efforts into our organizations in a way that change our culture. So I'm going to be asking you some additional questions as we move on, and it'll give you a chance to either unmute yourself and share or share in the chat. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off talking a little bit about what diversity and inclusion, what does that mean? I may have heard me say this before, but I'm constantly talking to my students about language. We use words all the time and we know what they mean, but we're not really able to articulate it in any other term, which separates us from it a bit. So when we're talking about diversity, it's really our objective, right? Our objective is to have a variation of persons included within our organizations that represent a number of different personal characteristics, physical characteristics, and inclusion is the method. It's meant to be the path of the ways that we create diversity, that we include many so that we have a diverse population to represent many different perspectives and to have a more flourishing organization. However, there's a lot of challenges that come along with this particular approach. And so I often talk about the annual diversity training as the annual inoculation, right? It's like this one and done, once a year, everybody attend, and we hope that it's going to have a significant benefit. So here are the issues with this that I want to tell you about. First of all, thousands of studies have demonstrated that these annual trainings have virtually no benefit because people forget whatever they have learned after a few days. And even if they didn't, the problem is that knowledge doesn't create change, right? Action creates change. So we make the mistake of thinking if we just have the knowledge that we'll be able to shift the way our organization functions and shift our culture. But I use all kinds of examples on this, but I will just say, like, I know that I need to drink 64 ounces of water a day. Do I do it? No, not always, right? I try to, but not always. Like, I know I'm supposed to, if I want to get a good night's sleep, to turn my lights off, to not take my computer to bed, to not have the TV on. I know all of that. And yet I still go to bed with my computer every night, right? How do we put the information that we gain into action? And by putting it into action, we retain it, right? We retain what we practice. So an annual training doesn't really give us that opportunity. So it doesn't work the ways that we hope. In addition to this, annual trainings are really focused on a management style approach to the issues of diversity and inclusion. And that, in addition, is very problematic because when we think about a management style, management is really focused on maintaining and rather than working towards a vision, right? It's really focused on correcting a problem rather than inspiring change. And when we look at really how diversity trainings are created and what their purpose is, generally organizations implement annual trainings on diversity and inclusion to preempt lawsuits. And that is a huge problem. When we're thinking about, well, we have to have diversity and inclusion efforts because if we do this, then we'll keep us from getting a lawsuit. And diversity becomes a buzzword. It becomes something that is resented by people who don't want to go to annual training, and it doesn't work. It doesn't change the culture. It doesn't impact the top-down structure of the organization in a way that is addressing these issues. And the scope becomes very, very limited. We don't want to have lawsuits. We're going to have an annual training, and then we can say we did something. Nothing changes. We have to focus on changing culture, and it has to be from the top down, right? So in thinking about all of this that I just shared with you, if anybody wants to unmute yourself, please feel free. If you want to chat, please feel free to do that as well, post in the chat. How does this relate to your own experience within your organizations? I'm opening up my chat here. Does anybody want to share?
Can you ask the question again?
Oh, yes. And thinking about like this idea of an annual training with the goal of keeping organizations from experiencing lawsuits and not having a true impact on the culture within an organization. How does that relate to your own experience? Do you see that happening within your organizations? Or perhaps it might not be something you want to reveal, like for confidentiality reasons and whatnot. But my question is, when you hear it, some of you said like, yes, you felt like the diversity trainings have been really effective. When you're thinking about how diversity trainings have been structured historically, and by the way, this hasn't changed over the last 50 years, do you see these kinds of challenges existing within your own organizations?
See, my organization, they consider being what I guess it would be ethical as a leadership attribute. So when they do their ethics training every year and diversity is a part of it, it's not so much about checking box. Like it's you are expected to have certain attributes as an employee, and everyone is to adhere to these leadership attributes no matter what your role is. No role is too small to be ethical, right? Mm-hmm. So they treat it like it's a key foundation of being a good employee. So it's not well, this is the minimum we have to do to avoid being sued. It's we want to have respect among all of our employees. We want non-toxic cultures and things like that. I'd say they're pretty aggressive in their different ways they train.
Sherry, I think that's outstanding. Like, I think that's really outstanding to hear that. And I think that a lot of organizations are working towards changing their approaches and focusing more on leadership styles and the ethical implications and ensuring that everybody has a role, because statistically, and I hate to say statistically, but that's the truth, we see that organizations that really give attention to these areas do flourish, they do better. And it's about having a positive culture and having happy employees and people who feel comfortable where they're at and know that they are valued for who they are and what they contribute, right? So I think, I mean, it sounds like you are in an organization that has really recognized that and put that into practice, which is really outstanding. Thank you for sharing that.
So this Jackie, I would say in my situation, I feel like we're in a diverse culture and it's a supported culture and there is a good leadership style, but I do feel like the training isn't that beneficial. So it's like a combination, it is it's like checking a box and doing the legal things that you have to do from the management perspective, because you have to do it to follow guidelines and meet, regulations and whatnot. But on the other hand, I also feel like it's a fairly diverse culture, but the training doesn't support that or nourish that much. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Thank you so much for sharing. And I think because, when we think about the styles of, diversity trainings, as I said, the approach has not changed in 50 years, and it's difficult to come up with a new way, right? It's difficult to say, we're going to create a whole new structure and do something brand new. I think generally the thought is, why reinvent the wheel? This is how people do it. This is how we do it. And so we're just going to keep with that, right? We're doing what we need to do. But in actuality, there's a lot of change that needs to happen in the ways that organizations approach this. I think it's wonderful to hear that your culture is so diverse. But as you're saying here, the training does not support that. And I think that those kinds of things have really been the norm for a long time, although some organizations are making some shifts, which is really great. So what I want to move on to talk about is the topic of intersectionality. And intersectionality is something that I am always focused on in thinking about in the ways that I'm engaging my classrooms, my teaching, my research. It is something that is at the forefront for me always. And it's a buzzword, I feel like, in some fields, and in others, people haven't heard of it or don't really know what this means. And it's such a critical term, and maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be this term. So I will say this is in the handout that you will receive, is that Kimberly Crenshaw came up with the term back, I think, in the 80s, after she became aware of a case in Detroit where a group of African-American women filed a lawsuit against a manufacturing company because at the time, women were getting promoted and African-American men were getting promoted, but African-American women were not getting promoted. And the issue was that, they were not getting promoted because of their intersecting identities. They weren't just women. They're not just African-American. They're African-American women. They have more than one identifying factor that results in particular structural oppression. And those intersecting factors were keeping them from getting hired or keeping them from getting promoted. Now, what happened was the lawsuit was filed and the judge kicked it out of the court and said, you have to file based on being women or based on being African American. That is what you have to file on. You can't file on both. And it was like, but that's not the issue. And this is where intersectionality comes into play. And when we're talking about diversity, diversity is very much focused on this idea that we talk about categories in this very siloed way, whereas intersectionality calls us to think about the many different identities that we have and the way they overlap or intersect and how that impacts our lived experience. So I'm not going to make you answer a question again, but I put here, like, how does this make you think differently about your own identity? And I hope you really think about that. And maybe it's something we can come back to at the end, since we got started a little bit late. But I really want you to think about that, because we each have intersecting identities, and they lead to varying degrees of experiences of inequity and injustice in the workplace and in society in general. So I have mentioned this before, but I'm just going to go back for 1 second. Diversity, when we think about diversity, we talk about race, we talk about gender, we talk about age, we talk about sexuality, we talk about ability, right? And we organize things in these very siloed categories. And it doesn't create space for us to talk about persons in a holistic way that acknowledges who they are in all facets of their identity. Whereas intersectionality says, like, I can't just talk about Sarah as being a woman. I can't just talk about Sarah as being Asian American. I can't just talk about Sarah being a working mother, right? Those are all parts of her identity, and they're not separate for her. They all work together to create her lived experience and the challenges she experiences in the workplace. And so we need to shift our thinking when we're talking about diversity to acknowledge each person's overlapping and intersecting identities and the way it impacts them in the workplace. This is really critical for a number of reasons. It identifies, this more intensified level of discrimination that is experienced by persons who have more than one identity that is considered to be of an underrepresented group. It also acknowledges that we're not one-dimensional, right? We have multiple factors that make up our identities. It also acknowledges that when we're not talking about ourselves, our employees, our coworkers, our teammates, our colleagues, when we're not talking about ourselves in a way that is holistic, that does represent who we are, it is non-inclusive, period. It is. And that leads to people feeling unwelcomed. It leads to people feeling like they need to hide who they are, that they need to fit in rather than belong. And that leads people to be unhappy in their jobs, and it leads to high turnover rates. And so the question is, how do we move away from this management style approach that focuses on, we have to have an annual training. It's the right thing to do, even if the focus isn't legal action, protecting from legal action, right? But moving away from this idea of a once-a-year training that doesn't take into consideration a holistic view of a person's identities, to getting to a place where everybody feels like they are represented, that they are welcomed, and that they are part of the conversation. And that's really what a leadership approach to addressing diversity and inclusion looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and jump slides. And I know I kind of said this, I always get ahead of myself with the slides, so I apologize. But really, this leadership approach is about dismantling this management style and moving from controlling tactics to creating a vision that looks to inspiring change. And that means shifting culture and looking for a culture like Sherry is talking about, where every person and every voice is included. Every person is important. And so we want everyone to feel welcome. We want diversity to be appreciated and recognized as being critical. We want it to be more than a buzzword, right? And we want to acknowledge that within our structures, that there is unconscious bias, and that unconscious bias really supports structures that have dictated a lack of a commitment to diversity from the top down. So what is the unconscious bias? How do we acknowledge it? How do we address it? And how do we see the big picture? How do we acknowledge what the vision is and recognize the ways that we can inspire change within our communities? So there's some tactics that I want to talk about that I think are really critical to shifting from the annual inoculation, as I like to refer to it, to thinking about ways that we're integrating this work into the daily culture, the daily life and the daily culture of an organization. So the first point I want to make is talking about flexibility. So when we have these annual trainings, we think of them as a one size fits all. Everybody comes to this training, everybody gets the same information, and everybody leaves, with the same ideas. And the thing is that people have different lived experiences. People have different levels of knowledge around diversity, and people have different needs when it comes to these kinds of trainings. So it would make more sense to have flexibility around training and even creating multiple trainings a year that offer different approaches that look at different experiences in ways that create dialogue for persons around their different experiences and the ways they engage the culture in various ways, right? Based on their identities and what they have come to understand inclusion meaning. Because oftentimes inclusion, again, is about fitting in and not belonging. It's like we want to be inclusive. We want everybody to be included, but that means being included in doing it in a particular way, rather than honoring each of our identities. So flexibility is really key. Second is thinking about welcoming every person to the table, because again, you want all employees to feel part of the conversation, and we want to encourage everyone to participate in dialogue and to foster an ongoing dialogue, so that, diversity trainings are opened up to everyone rather than just management teams or particular development programs, which sometimes happens in organizations. They think, okay, we're going to offer these trainings just to these persons because they're at higher level positions, and not realizing that everybody needs to be a part of the conversation. And again, that really impacts the culture of the organization in saying every single person here is important. Every single voice is important. Everybody has something to offer, and we want everybody to be included and belong, right? So thinking of ways that we are opening up the engagement in diversity that is very inclusive. Next, again, going back to language, I think language, again, is so important in acknowledging the ways that we've used diversity to create siloed categories, and acknowledge that it's not just about race, it's not just about gender, it's not just about age or sexuality or ability, and so on and so forth. It is about each individual being included, feeling that they belong, and acknowledging that there are varying degrees of inequity that a person experiences based on one's identity. And, when we think about issues when it comes to hiring, wage equity, having access to professional development, all of these things are impacted by intersectional identities. So it's like, well, no, we have made room for women to participate in training. Great. But are they all white women? No, we've included African Americans in these management trainings, but great, but are they all men? We need to look at the complexities really that exist within identity and not silo those categories. So bringing that language in and helping people to recognize the ways that we each have these intersecting identities can really shift the dialogue and allow us to recognize each other in a holistic way, and also to really consider the ways that we experience things very differently. So I will, like I always say, like I talk about, yes, I'm a woman, but I'm also a very privileged woman. And I'm a Caucasian woman, and my experience is very, very different from, other women, women of color and women who have other intersecting identities, right? And recognizing that and really honoring that is critical. So the next piece I think that is important is thinking about ways that we can integrate interventions. So instead of only focusing on reducing bias within individuals, we want to encourage participation across teams, across management, across all persons in the organization, that allow them to allow all persons to engage in a conversation and across departments. Because the other piece is we often get siloed in our little sections, right? It's like, well, I'm on this marketing team over here, and I'm on the HR team over here, so we don't see each other, we don't talk to each other. And yet persons across those teams have different ideas and different experiences. And being able to engage in conversations across teams can make a huge difference and bring different ideas in across cultures. So thinking about ways that it's integrated throughout the organization, and it's not just about reducing bias, but also about creating conversations and creating opportunities to further the diversity within the organization, that really encourages social accountability and allows people to feel invested in the success of diversity efforts. So I think integration is also a really key piece. And finally, keeping that conversation going, moving beyond the annual training to think about ways that everyone is participating. We're acknowledging holistic identities, seeing the big picture, integrating within our organization, and keeping it at the forefront on a daily basis. These are really great ways to start a shift in culture, to begin a positive change and working towards a vision that really is inclusive, rather than calling people to fit in. So with that said, I'm going to open it up for some Q&A, and also ask if anybody wants to comment on the idea of thinking about intersectionality and what that means for you and your identity, or what that means for your organization.
So as you were talking, I'm trying to think about the training that I've experienced, but then the culture that we live in. And the thing that, and you were talking about the holistic person. And I remember going to an all hands meeting years ago, probably 2010, 2011. And the owner of the company doing a talk and saying, how in her vision was that it was God, family, your work, community, and yourself. And that was kind of her list of priorities. But, and I had a mother who was just being diagnosed with being sick, and having that support of being able to put my faith first and put my family first and feel supported in a holistic way, and how that was so pivotal to me, to being able to work and to live through that situation, and how that is a culture throughout for all individuals, meeting the individual where they need. And it's not just the owner's faith base, but supporting all different faith communities and bringing those into the conversation. So that idea of holistic person, yes, we get the standard training, but there's also a culture that supports you, not just in your work, but in your family life, in the tough situations you're facing. And I think that type of cultural thing and the holistic thing, I don't know if that necessarily talks to intersectionality, but we have a fairly diverse work environment, and meeting each of those individuals in different places is challenging, but it is something that is definitely part of our culture, and I think it's a pretty cool thing to experience.
Jackie, I so appreciate you sharing that. And I think that is so important. And I say this all the time, is that I think a critical piece of leadership is acknowledging that our employees are not just employees. They have lives outside of work and all kinds of things going on. And we have to recognize them as a whole person. In that, their life is not just about work, and things that happen outside of work impact work. And how can we support persons on all levels, right? So I think it's amazing that you have that kind of work environment, and that's really outstanding. Thank you.
And I think when you're supported in that way, when you're supported in that extends beyond the work community, that you then are motivated to give back more on the times when they need help. It's a give and take relationship that really creates a culture that you support each other in times of need, the work community as well as your family community. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I've said this before. I mean, it's why Google has such a successful work atmosphere, and why it's such a flourishing company, is because they're focused on employees being happy, and happy employees support the company, right? And the same goes back to when we're talking about diversity and inclusion. We want diverse voices in our organizations to be bringing forth ideas and helping to advance the vision and inspire change. And we're not going to have those voices if those persons don't feel included. But when they do feel included, we see incredible flourishing that embraces a diversity of ideas and perspectives, and acknowledges the values of all persons engaged, which is just an amazing thing, and something we should all be working towards. So I could not agree with you more.
Yeah, and then the result of that is that you then have people who stay for a very long time.
Yes, and you get rid of the high turnover rate and risk losing talented employees. Yes. Thank you, Jackie. Does anybody else have questions or comments you'd like to share?
So Gina, I'd like to share something. At the top of the meeting, you said that Kimberly coined this term in the late 80s, and I actually did a quick Google search. It's 1989 specifically, so that was over 32 years ago that she coined the term. And I don't know if our audience here are television watchers, but there's a show called New Amsterdam that specifically spoke about intersectionality in a hospital setting amongst employees, and how we could address it and what could we do, and actually use the term. And so I feel like when we start to see these terms that are, the purview of academia, right, and, other in sort of very smaller, sectors, when it comes to mass media, right, and popular culture, and it starts to infiltrate television shows and, raising awareness in and around it, I feel like we're at a very critical point. And these women here that you're with us today, you are all the trailblazers, and you are, interested in things that everyone else needs to know and understand about. And so I commend you for coming today. And I wanted to just say a quick thank you and let you know that, if you want to learn more from a pop culture point of view, New Amsterdam is a television show that can help you sort of see it play out in drama.
Yes, well, I want to share this just based on what Sarah said. I don't know if anybody watches the show Blackish. I always say that Blackish is educating Americans on intersectionality, like unknowingly, because of the ways they address so many critical issues in a way that is engaging and funny. It's a fun show. It's funny, and honestly, my daughter and I watch it together, and it's such a great opportunity for us to watch together and have conversations around really critical issues, and it's helping her to learn about things that are really important in a way that we can do together and enjoy it, and it's fun. But I even use some of the episodes in my classes sometimes, which my students love, right? They're like, oh, homework, I get to watch an episode of Blackish. This is awesome. But, you know, it's such a great show, and 22-minute episode. They cover so many important topics that are really a part of the critical dialogue in our society today. And they had a great episode on feminism, and how feminism really leaves the voice of women of color out of the conversation, and that needs to change, right? How we need intersectional feminism. It was a great episode. And I think, yes, we see these things coming up in pop culture. We often don't realize it is what it is. But it's there, and there's ways we can really cling on to it and learn from it and engage in dialogue, like I said, with our kids or with our colleagues about, did you see this episode? It was great. It was funny, but it also hit on this really important issue and gave me something to think about in a new way. So, you know, I love using pop culture as an opportunity to talk about these kinds of things.
So I have another question, unless someone else.
Yeah.
So do you know, to be honest, you know, Sarah, you're saying that this term was coined 32 years ago, which is a little bit shocking. I did not hear this term until I took your class this semester. And I've worked in the federal marketplace for almost 20 years.
Yeah.
And you hear diversity all the time, but you've never heard this term. And the points that you point out of the siloed view of that versus a holistic view seems so critical. Do you know, as somebody who's so focused on this, have concerns about getting this word out and changing the focus of diversity to intersectionality and the challenges of that? You know, normally the federal government, if there's a buzzword, they're on the forefront of trying to put those things in place.
Yeah.
And I haven't heard it. And so that concerns me a little.
Yeah. So here's the thing. The work goes back far before Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term, right? She gave us language to use to really talk about it. But if we even go we can go far back in history. I'm just going to use this one example. You know, if we talk about the women's suffrage movement, we all talk about the women's suffrage movement, it being a key point in the history of feminism. It's called first wave feminism. Women's suffrage was about white women. It did not include women of color. Women of color, in fact, were purposefully excluded because it was like, well, we won't get the right to vote if we include women of color. So this has been a historical issue in the ways that we silo categories. We don't have a holistic view, and people are left out of the conversation. And it really needs to be addressed. But why isn't it at the forefront? And I think that it is because language like intersectionality really is stuck within the confines of academia. And people don't hear it, they don't know it. And my question always is, how are we building a bridge between the work that's being done in academia and in our greater communities? Like, how do we build that bridge? How do we work together? How do we get out of the ivory tower? I think that as academics, we are failing miserably if we're writing books that 3 people read, you know, so that we can kind of stroke our egos and say, I came up with this great idea, but nobody knows what it is, right? And unfortunately, I shouldn't say, you know, not all academics are about stroking their egos. That's like a rare case. That was not, I didn't mean that in a mean way. But what I mean is, we get wrapped up in the research and the work and forget that it needs to be something that we can connect to make greater change, and it gets stuck. And so one of the things for me has always been like, okay, we have to put intersectionality at the forefront it's something that it needs to be incorporated in every facet of our society, and thinking about the ways that we're engaging with one another in the workforce. But also I need to acknowledge that as a white woman, I'm not the person who should be doing the work, right? Like I'm not the person, I'm not the voice that should be leading the conversation. And I think that's really important to acknowledge as well. So, you know, I'm really grateful to Ursuline that the college has given me the opportunity to, you know, teach in the classroom and to do webinars like this and to talk about these issues. But I do want to say, like, especially here in the Cleveland area, Erica Merritt, who's well known in the community, is doing amazing work around diversity and inclusion that focuses on intersectionality for corporations and organizations locally. And she is a great consultant to reach out to if you're looking to do work in your organization. And just a small plug, we recently launched our podcast through the Institute called Women's Work, and an episode with Erica Merritt is coming up in the next few weeks. So you can hear her talk about some of these things. I'm sorry for being so long-winded. Any other questions or comments? Great. I just want to thank all of you for being here today, and thank you for the comments that you shared and the key points that you made. And it's really wonderful to hear that some of you are engaged in such wonderful organizations with great positive cultures. So I really appreciate you sharing, and I'm thankful that you are here. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for your time today. We'll send you a link to the recording of the session, and also Gina's handout that she made. We see it's really great. It'll help reinforce some of the stuff that we talked about here. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to get in touch with me, with Gina, with the Institute. We're here for you in this, and you're the reason why we exist. So thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.